Hello again. It's good to be back with you. We're going to do a little bit different today than what we had outlined when we did the last lesson 3 weeks ago. I'm going to only briefly mention 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and then I'm going to talk about the development of the Old Testament. To me, this is all extremely interesting as to how these canon, Canon, books came together, because it's not at all what people suspect. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are late books. They are in the Catholic Bible. My New Jerusalem Bible has it. They are not in the Protestant Bible. They're two historical texts dealing with the Maccabean Rebellion, which runs about 160 to 130 BC, and it's a rebellion against oppressive Greek overlords who were the successor to Alexander. 1st Maccabees is basically an ethnic history of this rebellion. One of the leaders was known as Jesus Maccabeus. The hammer is what Maccabeus means. And he led for a while. He was successful. Then he'd get killed, and his younger brother would take over, etc. So they went through about 4 brothers. They eventually ended up winning their independence. And that's a 1st Maccabees straight historical account. Really no mention of God, a little bit of Jewish ritual, but that's it. 2nd Maccabees is the same period, not an easy read. None of these are easy reads, and they have a lot more theological issues in there that are not in 1st Maccabees. So it has divine forces that are coming down from heaven, men on horses, spiritual but physical men on horses who lead them to victory in several situations. It actually has some theological undertones in it that the Roman Catholic scholars have used extensively over the centuries. It has resurrection of the dead in a physical form. It has the intervention by divine forces, actually where you could see them. As I described earlier, it has prayers for the salvation of the dead, which is a part of a Roman Catholic ritual we don't use in our Protestant churches, and it has those are the ones I can think of at this point. So it's actually a little more important to the Catholic thing, because a lot of these things, intercession prayers for the dead, and the stress on the value of martyrdom, have been part of Catholic dogma for a long time, and it's really faded as we head into the Protestant Revolution. So that's 1st and 2nd Maccabees put aside. The main interest in them now is the Hanukkah festival came out of that era of the revolt against the Greek overlords, which really took off about 160 BC. And Hanukkah is, one of my Jewish colleagues back in Baltimore said to me, it's really a very minor festival when you compare it to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur or Passover and stuff. But it's the proximity to Christmas that gives it a lot more play for Jewish youth and families because of this huge Christian festival, which is happening in mid-December. So that's all I really want to say. When you talk about developing the Old Testament, people think there's this clear documentation as to how this happened, and there isn't. There's very little documentation, and there's a lot of conjecture and looking back at an evolutionary process. Both Old Testament and New Testament came together in an evolutionary process. There was not a convention that voted them in, these are in and these are out. And that didn't happen. And the writings were probably done over several hundred years. Most people think that the compiling the ancient texts, the ancient stories about Moses and David and all that, probably happened during the Babylonian exile, as this exiled community was trying to hold itself together to keep people adherent to the ancient faith of the Hebrews, and rather than drifting into the paganism of the Babylonians. And that's logical to me. And so you have two major differences in the Old Testament. And exactly when these happened And how they happened is not entirely clear. I'm going to do the best I can explaining. I find this fascinating. It shows how difficult it is to be exact in your scriptures about how important it is to be open-minded and knowledgeable about the background. Sometime in probably the 2nd century BC, so you're talking 150 to 130 to 100 BC, in Egypt, there was a very active Hebrew community. Many of these people had fled before the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem several hundred years before. The Egyptians had welcomed them, and they had settled in up the Nile in an island called Elephantine, and Prophet Jeremiah apparently joined them. And he was trying to keep their religion pure then. But by the time that that's in 595 AD BC, by the time the 2nd century comes around, most of these people had lost the ability to read Hebrew. Hebrew is a different language, it's distinctive, it's not easy, and they had lost that ability. So they decided, with the support of the Egyptians, and all kinds of legends around this, to take the Hebrew scriptures and translate them into the common Greek. Now, this Greek is called Koine, K-O-I-N-E Greek. It's the common Greek spoken by the people at the time in the 2nd century, 1st century BC, first couple centuries AD. And this is the Greek that the Christians spoke and the Christians read. So they decided to translate the Hebrew text that they had and the legends about him into this form of Greek. So the legend is, which I think is legend, it's called the Septuagint, which is the 70, is that 70 scholars sat down and translated these books in 70 days. Now, that sounds like, did George Washington chop down the cherry tree and not lie about it or something like that? It's so hard to sort that. It doesn't matter. But what happened was an extraordinarily important event for early Christianity, because they took this, and here's a copy of it. I collect all kinds of odd Bibles. You all know I love the Bible, or I wouldn't be doing this. And they translated it into Greek, the Koine Greek, the common Greek of the time. And if you think about how different is Koine Greek than the classical Greek that I studied in college, which was from the 5th century BC, that's like learning modern English, which with Koine would be the equivalent of, and trying to read Shakespeare. Shakespeare's hard enough for people like us to read, but if you had learned English as a second language and then tried to read Shakespeare, it really would be challenging. You go back to Chaucer, it's almost unintelligible. So the language has changed appreciably over time. So this is the Septuagint. Is it the same books of the Old Testament that are in the Hebrew Bible? No. It's very interesting. There's 7 extra books in here First and Second Maccabees, which we talked about, and those are basically ethnic histories about the Maccabean Rebellion. There's 2 books that I consider part of the historical romance literatures, which is similar to what Esther is, and Daniel has some, but particularly Esther is the best example. And these are Judith and Tobit, and they're written at this time, about 150 BC, but they're placed back 400 or 500 years before. So it falls into the historical fiction category. And they're a nice read, and it shows the triumph of the really determined, loyal Hebrew people over the evil of pagan oppressors. Then there's Baruch, which is supposedly written by the scribe of Jeremiah, who was Baruch, and it's more of an exhortation to, cast aside the evil things and do this. Not a problem with any of these books. And then there's 2 wisdom books, which are similar to Proverbs, and the one just called Wisdom, and there's one called Ecclesiasticus, or the works of Ben Sira, Bensera. It's a 2-person name, and it's a book very similar to Proverbs. So, is it a problem to me that these books are in there? No. Is it a problem to me that they're not in our Bible? No. I think they're relatively minor books, that there's not a problem with it. How important was this text of the Old Testament for Christianity? Extraordinarily important, because as Christianity evolved, it was in the Greek-speaking world. Paul went out and Christianized the Eastern Mediterranean. We do not know how Egypt was Christianized. It's not really in Paul's letters or in Acts and all that. But he Christianized the whole Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean, because Greek was the common language really over to the border with the Persians in Iran. So this became the scriptures that were available to the early Christians. Remember that the New Testament, which we will discuss in its formation in a couple lessons, really didn't come together till between 320 and 360 AD, 300 years after Jesus' life. So prior to that, the only firmed up scriptures you had was this, the Septuagint. They have actually found relatively ancient copies of this going back to about 200 to 300 AD, and shows that the text we have is very close to that text there. So it's been extremely interesting, and it's been very, very important, and it still remains the source of Old Testament for the Catholics. How did this happen that we have two separate Old Testaments? Well, when Martin Luther decided to translate the Bible out of Latin, which he spoke, of course, as he had a doctoral degree in theology, and into German, he decided to translate I forgot, I made a mistake here. The second point as to how this became part of the Catholic Bible is this. This is the Vulgate. And this is the Latin Bible in the common vulgar Latin, and this was translated about 170 AD. No, it's about 300 AD by St. Jerome. I have to look my date up. I think it's about 170, 180. Translated into the common Latin by St. Jerome, and he translated the Old, and he used the Septuagint, Old Testament, because he did not have access to a Hebrew comprehensive Old Testament, and he did not speak Hebrew, most likely, read Hebrew. So he used this, and this became the Catholic Bible. When Martin Luther decided to translate the Bible into German, he went back to the original sources as best he could. He used this for the New Testament, but he went back to the Hebrew. Copies of the Hebrew Old Testament were available at the time, and he used that. And in that, you did not have those 7 extra books, so he didn't put them in. The Catholic Church has continued to keep them as scripture. They confirmed this in the Council of Trent, which went on for like 15 years in 1545 to 1560. It's kind of the Counter-Reformation, as the Catholic Church tried to clean up a lot of the problems that had developed over the centuries in response to the Protestant Reformation. So that's how these things evolved into the different structures that we have. Now, what about the Hebrew text? Well, it's very interesting because you did have a lot of other writing going on at the time. Most people don't realize how many, we even have some of these books that never made it into either one. Here's Jubilees, which is, these are called in the intertestament period between the development of the Septuagint and the development of the Hebrew scripture. There's 4 books of Enoch. Here they are. These are available now. And I have 2 of these massive tomes. I'll just show you one, but these are 2. These are apocalyptic literature of the Hebrew from the period between 150 to 200 BC and the Christian era, 150 to 200 AD. And apocalyptic literature is usually, that's the end of the world's coming, and there's going to be this huge trauma and this big battle, and good will triumph over evil, and God will rescue us from all this evil around us. Those are usually written in times of great stress. They were under a lot of abuse by the Greeks, and then under a lot of abuse by the Romans. So a lot of these books were written as part of this projection of God's going to save us from this. None of those predictions have come true. Revelation, of course, has never come true. And periodically people predict that the end of the world is coming. Pat Robertson has said the end of the world is coming 2 or 3 times, and it hasn't ended yet. So I don't really worry about the apocalyptic books. Where about the Hebrew text? Well, it's not entirely clear there either as to how this evolved. The Hebrew texts were used probably in the homeland by the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes. You had those 3 groups at the time, and you did not have a firmed up, this is what our Holy Scriptures are these books and only these books. Didn't have that yet. And you had these three rival groups that were at each other's throats. The Sadducees, very conservative, only the first 5 books. The Pharisees, much more community-based, and the Essenes were their own group. And the Romans come through in 66 to 70 AD, the first Jewish war. They wipe out the Sadducees because they were all in Jerusalem. They killed everybody when they conquered Jerusalem. When you've been besieging a city for 3 years and you finally break in, pretty much the troops just run wild and kill everybody, which is probably what they did. We're not certain. They destroyed the Essenes about the same time. So both those groups disappeared. And the only group that survived were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the rivals of the Christians. Many of the Christian leaders had been Pharisees. Paul described himself as a Pharisee. And they had evolved away from that into Christianity. So what you have in the Hebrew, I do not have a Hebrew Bible. What you had in the Hebrew Bibles was the text came together. Nobody knows exactly when. And the Hebrew Bible that we have is basically put together by the Pharisees. And so the Judaism that we now have is really, in my opinion, the descendants of Pharisaic Judaism, from the group that survived the massacre in the 1st century. They had another revolt in 130 or so, and they survived that. The texts are very difficult because the original Jewish text until about 750 BC had only consonants, no vowels. So how you read them depends on what vowels you insert in there in your interpretation. Because if you have H blank W, is that how? Could be. Is it ha, like a laugh? Is it hew, like cutting down a tree? So there's lots of interpretation involved in that. About the Christian era, they began to have markers of similar type consonants in a way to designate where the vowels would sit. And this is called the Masoretic text, Masoretic. And there's, as I said, a large number of other Hebrew writings, which I showed you. And the text probably comes together into the writings that we have now about 100 to 200 AD. We just don't know. There's really no records. The Old Testament text is grouped by the Hebrews in 3 sessions, 3 groups. One is you had the Torah, which is the first 5 books. It really contains the law. If you've ever plowed through Leviticus, you have laws on this and laws on this and laws on this and laws on this. In the latter part of Exodus, you have a lot of these laws. So that first 5 books is in the Torah. Then you have what's called the prophets. Now, the prophets aren't just prophets. The prophets start from the post-conquest writings, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So these are really historical writings. And in that group, you have the former prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, people in that. And you have the latter prophets or the later prophets, including people, things like Jonah and things like that. Then you have the writings, and the writings include a wide variety of highly different collections, Psalms and Proverbs, which stand by themselves. Then you have Ecclesiastes, which is very different than most other books. And you have Song of Solomon, which is unique. And you have other types of writings like it. And they put Daniel in there because no one's really certain exactly where you put Daniel. Esther is in there in the writings. Again, I called it historical fiction. So having developed modern Hebrew, they compiled these things more by custom, that if it had been regarded as inspired scripture for a couple hundred years, then as you began to compile these together and you exclude these other books that I showed you, Enoch and Jubilees and all these apocryphal, these things come together by tradition. But that's all we know. So when did this firm up? We don't know. Probably around, my guess it was probably a little bit, people say around 80 to 100 AD, could be. I guess it's probably a little bit later, but this is just a guess, in the 150 range, as the Pharisee community got itself organized after the second revolt, and they scattered. When the Romans reconquered the Holy Land, they took off. So it was a large Jewish community up above Jerusalem. There was a large over in Babylon that had been left from the exile, a large in Egypt. The Egypt one used the Septuagint, and we don't really know. The oldest Christian Bibles we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, which really date from the 4th century, 350 or so. Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus. It's interesting that the older texts we have are actually Christian, rather than the oldest texts we have are Jewish. There are two old Jewish texts which date to very similar time to each other. One of them is the Aleppo Codex, and I might have seen this when I was in Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. I don't remember whether I saw it or not. It was a complete. A codex is the term for a book, because in a book you can write on both sides of the paper and use half as much paper as when you have scrolls. So the Aleppo Codex was a complete Old Testament in Hebrew of this Masoretic text, and it probably was written about 870. Just a second, I can check my date here, and it was. I think about 970 or 980 AD, and 950 is what I've got in my notes. Okay, and it stayed in Aleppo, which is in Syria. Remember, you had Jewish communities scattered through the Middle East, and it stayed there until 1947, when there were massive riots against the Jewish community, burning them out, killing them because of the creation of the State of Israel, and that it was smuggled out of the temple there, which was destroyed, and to take it into Israel. And most of it still exists. However, along the way, a lot of the really important writings of Genesis and Exodus disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. Some people say, well, they were disturbed in the riot and all that. Could be. One writer I've said thought that the people who did the smuggling filched some of the pages out as souvenirs. Now, remember, when Israel was created in 1947, it was primarily a secular Jewish state, not terribly religious, from refugee European Jews, rather than the much more conservative Jews that are dominating Israel now. Most of those very conservative people have actually migrated there from the United States, from the New York area. So Israel in 1947, 48, 49 was much more secular than it is without the religious communities that they have now. The second one that is intact is the Leningrad Codex. It's in the library in what's now was Leningrad. First was Petrograd, then Leningrad after the communists took over, now St. Petersburg in Russia. And it is complete, but it's not a clean copy. It's got erasures, it's got additions, it's got editing, probably to bring it in line with what's in the Aleppo Codex. So those are the two very ancient ones. What we don't, and that's as far back as those goes. But that's the one, the Codex from Aleppo and Leningrad is what was used by Luther to create his version of the complete Bible based on that. Now, that's the summary. I find this fascinating because it shows how God works in mysterious ways, and you do have certain differences in the text. Most of these differences, like I said, between the books that are in the Septuagint that aren't in our Bible, I don't think make any difference one way or the other. You do apparently have other minor differences. The Samaritans have their own Pentateuch, but it's only the first 5 books. Apparently there's some textual differences between that and the Hebrew Bible. Okay, I've seen the Samaritan Pentateuch. I actually touched it, but I couldn't read it, of course, and I don't know about that. There are reports that the Peshitta book, which is the Syriac Bible. These are a copy in Syriac, and this is the translation. That there are some differences in there, but I haven't studied that. And I'm just saying these minor differences really don't make any difference because the major message is fairly clear and fairly simple. It's one God. This is our God. You say, you have to obey the things, and you do this and love your neighbor and yourself and love the Lord, and sacrifice for the Lord, rather than all the minutia that people get hung up on, in my opinion. So that's a history. I hope I made sense trying to say this is an evolutionary process, that these books were written for a number of years, and between the writing about 500 BC, they probably started writing it in Babylonian exile, down till the close to the Christian era. These things evolved in those three groups, and the books came together. The Septuagint is probably, in my opinion, translated between 130 to 100 BC, because it includes Daniel, which was written about 160. It includes the Maccabean books, which are written about 130 BC, and so it's probably written between 130 and 100 or so. And the Hebrew text doesn't include those, so we can't date it as to when those texts came together. I think they came together in the Pharisee era, as Christianity was beginning to appear, and the Pharisee Jewish community was trying to survive the loss of Jerusalem and the loss of a lot of their people, and being scattered into exile. So that's a history of this. Thank you very much for your time, and for my daughter and Eric for taking the effort to do this. Next week we're going to do, there's really no reading for next lesson. It's going to be Palestine at the time of Jesus. What was the setup culturally, politically, at the time when Jesus came? Because that's very, very important. He came at a very particular time, because you had a stable Mediterranean basin, so Christianity could spread the whole way. You had a universal language in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was Greek, and allowed Christianity to spread. We'll do that next time, and then we'll follow that whenever we get to it, to development of the New Testament. Then we'll plunge in to do some church history just for fun. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much.